Love that title. I'm going to go ahead. I'm Rachel DiResta with Center for Planning Excellence, and we have three wonderful panelists today, and we are continuing our strain of talking about transit and transit-oriented development, and this is an exciting panel. So I'm going to introduce our three panelists all at once, and then they're going to give their presentations, and we'll leave some time for questions and answers at the end. First, I'd like to introduce John Rennie. He is Dr. John Rennie, early research professor of planning and urban studies at the University of New Orleans, and he's also the director of transportation studies. He also serves as associate director of the UNO Transportation Institute, which is home to a federally funded university transportation center, the LSU UNO Gulf Coast Research Center for Evacuation and Transportation Resiliency. Since moving to New Orleans in August of 2005, think about when that was, Dr. Rennie has been active as a leader in the city's recovery. He serves on a number of local and national boards within the transportation field. Along with working on many transit projects, Dr. Rennie has also convened several national conferences and workshops on issues related to transit-oriented development. And he's author and editor of Transit-Oriented Development, Making It Happen, a must book for anyone who is interested in the future of transit. Next will be Meredith Judy. She is a senior planner with Roadside and Harwell Incorporated, located in Alexandria, Virginia. She has 10 years of experience with expertise in the integration of urban and suburban land use patterns with multimodal transportation networks, including a full range of public transportation modes as well as auto, bicycle, and pedestrian infrastructure. She has managed many of the urban and regional transportation planning initiatives involving extensive public input and the development of detailed action plans. Ms. Judy is knowledgeable in the areas of parking and transit integration, transit-oriented development, pedestrian scale urban design, growth management policy, charrette management, and NEPA documentation. Her background includes leadership in the creation of award-winning form-based code for local development, and she has managed several comprehensive initiatives to establish land use plans promoting smart growth and sustainable development. CPEX was so impressed with the national conference called New Partners for Smart Growth, the very presentation that Ms. Judy presented there. And in fact, it's so funny, we found out Brian Leary was also in the room, and we all just came back from CPEX saying we have got to really feature that Virginia project in the CPEX Summit because it's just a wonderful example of how to. Mr. Brian Leary is the next speaker. Atlanta has one of the largest, most wide-ranging urban redevelopment projects currently underway in the United States, right in the heart of the city. Brian Leary is the president and CEO of Atlanta Beltline, the organization planning and executing the implementation of the Atlanta Beltline. Prior to joining the Beltline team, Brian oversaw the design and development of Atlantic Station, the largest urban brownfield redevelopment in the nation. Previously, Brian worked for Atlanta's downtown development organization, Central Atlanta Progress. And with CAP, that's the acronym, Brian helped implement the first tax increment financing district in the state of Georgia, the Centennial Park Area Overlay Zoning District, and expansion of the Downtown Improvement District. And it's just an incredible story of what's happening in downtown Atlanta, and I can't wait to hear more from our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My presentation this afternoon is based on a forthcoming report, which will be coming out probably in the next 6 months or so from the Transportation Research Board's Legal Research Digest series, Transit Cooperative Research Program, called Transit-Oriented and Joint Development Case Studies and Legal Issues. And this study was done in collaboration with Keith Bartholomew from the University of Utah, who's one of the authors of Growing Cooler, and former graduate assistant of mine, Patrick Wantor. We looked at the study that we did built upon this report, which some of you may have seen, not a very exciting cover, but in January of 1999, the Transit Cooperative Research Program put out what's called the Zoning and Real Estate Implications of Transit-Oriented Development. And this looked at TODs. It really, at that point in time, was beginning to define what a transit-oriented development was and looking at some of the legal and real estate implications of it. Well, since the last 10 or 11 years that have passed, a lot has happened in the world of TOD. And our study looks at a couple areas. The transit-oriented development legal side of it, which Keith led, was broken into these three sections of planning for TOD and joint development. He looked at a number of policies and statutes that were broken into the three categories of federal New Starts criteria for capital transit projects, state laws and programs, and regional laws and programs. And then on the funding side, we broke this down into the planning, funding, and then C, which is the agency authority to sponsor and invest in TOD joint development projects. But going back to the funding, it was broken into funding for TOD joint development related infrastructure and then funding for TOD joint development related housing and infill. So I'm not an attorney, and I rarely present on, these sorts of technical legal sorts of issues. They may not be the most exciting sorts of things for PowerPoint presentations at conferences. However, what I can tell you is that it is very important and vital for us to move into the implementation side of transit-oriented development in the real world, because in this country, where the rubber meets the road for any sort of real estate development has to deal with some sort of a legal issue, whether it's a contract or whether it's a government policy to make more flexible zoning. And these implications with respect for housing and transportation integration is what is one of the major barriers for transit-oriented development. So in the report, when it comes out, you will be able to find a fairly exhaustive list of policies, legislative and administrative programs at the federal level, and at the state level and at the regional level. And you can see here the states and the regions that we looked at. You'll also find an updated listing of case law that cover these topics of substantive due process and zoning authority, procedural due process, vested rights, consistency, NEPA and mini-NEPAs, eminent domain, and religious land use issues that are all involved with transit-oriented development. I don't have the time or the ability to go through each one of these cases, but just summarizing the legal side of the research that, again, was led predominantly by Keith Bartholomew. Now, it's important, I think, to think about what is the intention of this report. Okay, this is not your typical report that's written for the planning community. As a matter of fact, the intention of these reports is mainly for legal staff working for either transit agencies, redevelopment authorities, perhaps municipal governments, and I'm sure sometime from developers in the private sector as well. But from transit agency perspective and from municipal government perspective, attorneys don't understand sometimes the difference between transit-oriented development or sprawl-oriented development. They understand the difference of contracts and law. And Keith, in particular, was very instrumental for this research because he was one of the founding attorneys, environmental attorneys behind the Thousand Friends of Oregon and led the whole LUTRAC process back in Portland during the 80s and 90s. He is able to talk between the attorneys and the planning community. And in particular, the review process that we had to go through to get this document published was unlike anyone that I've ever had to go through in the past. We had a team of attorneys who I don't know how many there were, I don't know who they were, but we went through about 5 or 6 rounds of peer-reviewed comments back and forth in order to kind of get this thing over the hurdle, and they've finally accepted it for publication. So it was very exciting that it finally will be coming out after several years of research. What I'm really here to talk about is the case studies, because that's the area that I led the investigations and research on. We looked at 5 case studies across the United States, and we were trying to find examples of both transit-oriented development and transit joint development. Let me take a moment to describe the difference. Okay, a transit-oriented development is typically any sort of development that is oriented to a train station. In our research, we really only looked at rail stations, whether it was streetcar or commuter rail, light rail. And the image that you see here in the Pearl District is a great example of the physical nature of what a transit-oriented development looks like. Now, a transit joint development is where you would have any formal agreement between any 2 entities, whether it's public sector and public sector or public sector and private sector, to put a deal together to jointly develop a real estate project within a transit-oriented development. So it's a much more narrower definition. And our case study looked at examples where we could find not just transit-oriented developments, but also transit joint developments. Well, in the Pearl District in Portland, Oregon, is a phenomenal example of transit-oriented development. G.B. Arrington, a couple sessions ago, spoke in this room about the Pearl District, which he had a big role in. The research we found was that there's been about $3.5 billion of private investment in transit-oriented development within 2 blocks of the streetcar line built since 2002. Now, the lead agency was the Portland Development Commission, and they basically are in a very entrepreneurial organization. Not only do they do the planning, they also do the pre-development assistance, they package the deals together, and they help to turn it over to the private sector in order for the vertical construction of the buildings, the housing and the retail that goes along with that. Some of the key legal issues that we found in this particular case study related to getting the zoning approved, putting the public-private development agreements together, and also the issue of property tax abatement to spur redevelopment in this particular area. Now, I don't have the time in this presentation because I only have about 10 or 15 minutes, but the case study, when you read it, will have much more detailed information. Unfortunately, one of the things that got stripped out in our report was we had about 5 or 10 times more information about each one of these case studies that we had to boil down for the final published report. But what we've tried to do is to put an appendix in the document that gives examples of the contracts that the Portland Development Commission used in putting together these agreements with Hoyt Street Properties, which was the major private sector developer in that area. In summary, some of the key elements to success in this case study was that the development agreement had provisions for minimum development densities and a $700,000 private sector contribution to fund streetcar construction. Those were 2 of the key lessons from that particular case study, among others. Fruitvale, California, which is located in the East Bay in Oakland, was a very interesting transit-oriented and transit joint development. And as you'll see in this case study, along with one in Chicago that we'll see in a minute, it entailed a nonprofit-initiated development around Heavy Rail Station in the blighted inner city of West Garfield Park in Chicago. The lead agencies in this was called the Unity Council Community Development Corporation in partnership with BART and the City of Oakland. And some of the key issues in this was that the community BART partnership, I'm sorry, I think I said this was in West Garfield Park, which is wrong. I was confusing my Chicago case study. This in Oakland had a community BART partnership to overcome local objections, creative financing. They used, and we spell out in the case study all the different sources of financing. They put together over 30 different sources of financing to put this deal together. Ground leases between BART and the CDC, as well as land swap, transit agency relaxation of commuter parking replacement standards. And some of the key elements of success in this particular case study was the community champion, which was the Unity Council, allowed the partnership with the transit agency to create a new vision for the station precinct. Originally, they wanted to put in structured parking deck around the station. And when the Unity Council came forward and said, we don't want structured parking, we want a mixed-use, community-oriented project, it really refashioned what Fruitvale became. This is a great example of affordable housing, many amenities, social service amenities like daycare centers, senior centers. It's a great example of a true community-oriented, transit-oriented, and transit joint development. A number of these case studies that you see have been completed, and you can go and walk around in them. And because they have been completed, and they were done over a period of the last 10 or 15 years, they also serve as examples for changing policies to make development more friendly for new forthcoming development. And this was a perfect example that BART, which is the Bay Area Rapid Transit, they changed they used to have a one-to-one parking replacement policy, that if they wanted to hand a site to a developer and it had 300 parking spaces in it, the developer, whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit developer, would have to come in and put those 300 parking spaces in a parking structure, and then they could develop vertically the remaining land. Well, after this project, BART realized that that was sort of a foolish project, because when you put the 300 parking spaces in a structured parking deck, number one, it's very expensive to do that. You're looking at $25,000 to $40,000 a space, depending upon the market that you're in, to build structured parking. But moreover, the people that live in those developments, they ride transit. And if you say that a certain percentage of those people are going to ride transit, the transit agency can justify reducing the number of commuter parking spaces and turn that space over into more housing for commuters or people who want to live in that area. This is the Bethel project, is the one in West Garfield Park of Chicago. This is another nonprofit-initiated development around a heavy rail station, also in a blighted inner city neighborhood. So very similar to the Fruitvale example. Bethel is also a CDC, and they partnered with the Chicago Transit Authority. And in this one, the key issues there was that the community partnership overcame the station closure to have creative financing. The CTA was going to close down this station. The CDC came up with a vision not just to keep the station open, but to really revitalize the whole area. And in this one, the key elements to success was Community Champion enabled the CDC to partner with the transit agency, and they created a LEED Gold project. Now, in this one, there was not a formal contract that we could find in our research. It was less of a formal, but more of an informal project. I just have two quick ones I'm going to go through quickly because my time is up. Plano, Texas is one where the municipality led the redevelopment of a suburban downtown area. And the key elements to success in this one was really the municipal leadership in planning, zoning, land assembly, and development marketing. And finally, in Morristown, New Jersey, this was a transit agency initiated joint development project where a private developer came in, and this was the first transit joint development for New Jersey Transit, which is one of the largest transit agencies in the United States. So, in conclusion, the key aspects of this research, beyond the usefulness of looking at the case law and the statutory law across the different states and regions, but in looking at the case studies, if we want to create more of a mixed approach for housing and affordable housing with retail and community services like daycare facilities and libraries and senior centers and healthcare clinics, what I can surmise from these case studies is the transit agency can lead the process. Private sector often has not really led joint development projects. Local governments can be in the lead. But what you tend to find are the most successful examples in these five where you do have the mix of affordability and the mix of community services is where you have a community development corporation leading the charge, bringing together the development, being creative and entrepreneurial. Those community development corporations, as we're seeing in New Orleans, also have the opportunity to partner with private sector developers to do a portion of the development. But all of the stakeholders, the transit agencies and municipalities, the nonprofit partners and the private sector partners, they're all important, and they're all key to bringing transit-oriented developments and transit joint developments together. So thank you very much.
All right, it's great to be here. I'm going to discuss today passenger rail and transit-oriented development, state and local collaboration in Virginia. And this is a project of the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation and supported with consulting services by my company, Roadside and Harwell, and AECOM Transportation. To give you a little bit of background so that you can understand sort of the context in which we did this project, the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation has four main areas of activity, and it is separate from the Virginia Department of Transportation. Those areas are funding support, advocacy, planning, and technical support for public transportation across the state. DRPT, though it is a focus on public transportation, recognizes that without the right land use patterns, their services cannot be successful, that the two have to be developed and envisioned together. So the benefits that DRPT sees are improved multimodal connectivity when you have transit-oriented development, increased mobility and transportation choice, increased accessibility to transit and passenger rail options, land use density supports the necessary ridership it needs for its services, and station area land uses are important to achieving all of these goals. DRPT develops statewide plans, such as this one for rail transportation across the state, and we focused on the corridor between Washington, D.C. and Newport News, the I-95, I-64 corridor. And the question became, if Amtrak service, which exists today on this corridor, is increased to reflect a commuter rail type service with commuter rail frequencies, could transit-oriented development emerge along this corridor? If it could, what would it look like? And in what ways would it benefit the local communities? And how do we get there? Of course, TOD is not the same in every community, and this corridor goes through a wide range of community types. So we focused on 6 stations that DRPT felt were representative of the different types of land uses that exist today along the corridor. And those are a rural county called Caroline County, a county, Henrico County, which is right now very suburban, with separated commercial and residential uses, automobile dependence. The town of Ashland, which is a small town with a college, and it grew up around the railroad and is very connected to its railroad heritage. However, it's very small and doesn't have enough population to support a station today. And then 2 urban redevelopment examples, the downtown Richmond and downtown Newport News. The methodology that we used, well, we started by trying to understand what are the elements of successful TOD in all circumstances. And we selected, or we identified those as the economic development climate. There has to be growth and development and a demand for development in the area to begin with. Then you need the land use policies that will guide that development to the stations in an appropriate land use pattern. Transportation connectivity, and that means, does your rail connect with your local bus service? Is there bicycle infrastructure? Are there sidewalks that are interconnected? And are there accommodations for the automobile? And local financing strategies. It really takes a commitment by the localities to do this. And frequently that's a local financial commitment. However, there are a variety of strategies that these localities can use to make it affordable, or an affordable approach for them. So our methodology in understanding these 4 characteristics of successful TOD was site visits and interviews, land use policy reviews, market assessment, TOD concept plan development, multimodal transportation analysis, economic impact analysis, and potential local funding mechanisms evaluation. Working with the local jurisdictions was a critical part of this process because in Virginia, it's the localities that control all of the land use planning decisions. So if the state is interested in land use planning to support its programs, it needs to create a partnership with the local jurisdictions. So in order to do this, we reached out to the local planners, economic development professionals locally, transportation staff, and stakeholders in these 6 diverse communities. The idea was to create partnerships between the localities and the state, DRPT, also to understand the local realities. What are the conditions there today to which we need to respond when we're designing TOD? We conducted field visits and interviews. We reviewed current planning documents. We established a technical advisory committee where we met with the representatives regularly to present our work and receive further guidance. And the results were that we were able to create a regional vision that responded to the context and the circumstances in each community. We were also able to, by understanding the communities, once our project was finished, offer some next steps for those communities moving forward. And this established a model for future regional transit planning. And in fact, right now we're working on a regional transit plan for the Hampton Roads region. And it builds on this methodology. Land use visions for TOD. Well, as I mentioned, we worked in a diverse range of communities. And I wish that I could share the case study examples from all of these because although there are fundamentally aspects of TOD that are the same, higher density areas, walkability, mix of uses, TOD can be adapted to the place, and it should respond to the place and be appropriate for the place in which it's located. But since I have time for one example, I'm going to share with you downtown Newport News, and if anyone's interested in these other examples, I'd be glad to share them later. Here's our statewide map again in our corridor, study corridor, and the example I'll review with you is Newport News, which is at the intersection of the James River as it extends out into the Chesapeake Bay, and it's at the end of this corridor. Downtown Newport News today. This is an aerial photograph. This, if you can see the cursor here, this is the James River. Over here is I-664 that extends through the middle of the city. Paralleling it in this location is the existing rail line. And then this is the city. This has been a major port since the late 1800s. Major shipbuilding location. There was significant growth population growth in this area and development in the early part of the 1900s, but post-World War II, as in many cities, people left the cities, fell into decline. Today, there remains major shipyards here with Northrop Grumman, a marine terminal, a lot of government uses, but there are also huge parking lots that are solely for surface parking. Streets have been converted into one-way streets, which makes it easy during shift changes to get people out quickly and people in quickly, but it doesn't allow experience of the downtown in the place, and certainly doesn't create a comfortable pedestrian environment. There are very few trees, so there's no shade. It's an unfriendly place at the moment. A few photos of Newport News in the past and today. You can see the surface parking, the abandoned buildings. However, Newport News, due to its location, the downtown is an important economic center. It's centrally located in the region, and it maintains the infrastructure, important infrastructure. It has historic buildings, it has a grid street pattern, it has the underground utilities that are already there. So it has a lot of the infrastructure that you already need, that you would need to build if you're building further out. It's still there. Okay, here's our land use plan. Again, here's the water. This is just sort of the same image you saw before, just with our overlay, the I-664 and the rail line. And the proposal here for this land use vision, which is something we created after the interviews and review of existing codes, centers on an Amtrak station right here. I hope you can see where I'm pointing. It's moving the current Amtrak station to the downtown, and the idea is that this would become a multimodal hub, that the proposed light rail in the region would connect here, the local bus service would connect here, and that it would become a hub of activity. And around it you can see we've drawn the quarter-mile and half-mile radii, which are typically known to be good walking distances. And in this area closest to the station, we're proposing very high-density, 7-story buildings, corporate office space, residential development, and then consistently ground floor retail to create an environment that's comfortable for pedestrians. Then towards the water, it steps down in height and intensity. You'll see that we have maintained some of the existing land uses, because this is not a plan to replace what's there now. It's to add and diversify the uses and make it a place that's active at all times, not just during shipbuilding times. The illustrative plan gives you a little better idea of how the buildings relate to the streets in this proposal. You can see how the parking lots have been moved into the center of the blocks into parking structures that are wrapped with mixed-use, multi-story structures. Again, here is the rail station as we're proposing it. There's Christopher Newport Park down here, which we're proposing with predominantly residential around it, but still a mix of uses and upgrades to the park. And greening, lots of trees on the streets. A vision of these visualizations we find really useful for people to understand how the city that's there today can transform. And so you'll see this is a visualization we've created of the station area. You can still see the train stations here in the back, the former parking deck. We're saying it could be wrapped with a mix of uses. We have vertical mixed use, many modes of transportation represented here, buses, bikes, the commuter rail station, lots of pedestrians. And then we have a bird's eye view, which gives another valuable perspective on the proposal. So now we'll move to the market analysis. What does it take to make this a reality? The zoning is actually quite good for this place, but because there aren't incentives to develop here, it's not happening, the redevelopment. This is our 50-year vision plan that you saw earlier, overlaid onto the downtown as it exists today. The concept is a phased implementation, and our market analysis shows that by 2015, the station could be built. And if the Economic Development Agency can begin to buy down the land in the area for redevelopment. Also, we expect there could be a medium-density mixed-use center of 100 residential units, 6,400 square feet of commercial. By 2020, we think there could be higher-density mixed-use adjacent to the station, medium-scale mixed-use further from the station, additional residential units, and retail that responds to all of the residential that's being built. Again, additional growth by 2030. Now, you'll see between 2030 and 2050, we show a very significant amount of growth. And that's because we've seen in other communities that once you plant the seeds, once you really show the development community and property owners that this area is revitalizing, we are committed to making downtown come back, then it really catches on and you can see exponential growth. So there's our 2050 vision. But absolutely, it requires a commitment to making this happen and providing incentives. Making it happen. We've spoken now briefly about the market conditions analysis. We also conducted an economic impact assessment, and we studied local financing mechanisms. Specifically, we looked at tax increment financing and transportation improvement districts as ways that the localities could either put in infrastructure to support new development or create joint development as a way to encourage developers to come to the area. Our economic impact analysis, just to look at the first line as an example, Ashland, it shows that between 2013 and 2030, there could be creation of 2,500 construction jobs, so more short-term jobs, and construction earnings of $192 million. Other job creation, long-term jobs of 2,800 jobs, and all earnings of $176 million, all other earnings. Projected property tax revenue, again for Ashland on the top line, construction square footage estimated at 2.5 million, construction value 556 million, property tax revenue additions 42 million. And for Ashland, you can see this is a very significant growth in the percent of revenue compared to what they have today. That's because Ashland is very small. If you look down that line, you'll see that there's a whole range of percentage increases depending on the size of the community today.
Is Ashland rural?
Ashland is a very small town, yeah, and it's relatively rural around it, yes. Potential funding sources we identified as city, county, general funds, state capital grants, CMAQ funds, flexible STP funds, other special federal appropriations, private sector investment, and again, tax increment finding and transportation improvement districts. Tax increment financing allows these communities to draw on future tax revenues to invest today in its infrastructure or incentives for development. Transportation improvement districts gives individual or the businesses in the area a chance to tax themselves, hopefully recognizing that in the future their property values are going to be significant. So if they go ahead and contribute to public investments now, long term they'll benefit. All right, I'm going to wrap it up there, but if anyone's interested in this, any further information, I'd be glad to speak with you.
All right. Meredith's presentation is actually really appropriate for Louisiana if you look at that entire line because of the rural and urban connection. I know that was a question that came up earlier this morning, and so I saw that full presentation. I think you did even more of the stations all the way down from Richmond. So follow up with her and get that. It's great to be here from Atlanta because I think like Atlanta and Louisiana have this kind of unique connection. I always see a bunch of folks either in kind of black and gold showing up in Atlanta with wins, or folks in purple and yellow showing up and winning. And unfortunately, since 2005, there's a lot more people from Louisiana living in Atlanta too. And so I think we have a unique connection from an indomitable spirit too, right? We were burned to the ground 150 years ago. And you'd think it'd be ancient history, but it's amazing how much it still comes up in conversation. And so we've constantly been trying to reinvent ourselves. We probably aren't the first to come up with an idea. In fact, a few years ago, planning and communism were kind of interchangeable. in Georgia. And we've kind of seen what's gone on around the country, places like Portland, and then tried to react fairly quickly. That's what I see happening here. The quality of folks that are showing up at this conference and the speakers, I've been blown away. You guys are really blowing and going. When I go back to Atlanta, I'm going to let everyone know things are really happening here in Louisiana. And one of the things happening in Atlanta is something called the Atlanta Beltline. And it's a huge idea, but it's a very simple one and not a very new one at all. The reason why I have this slide up is that had we been here a year ago, I would have had to show you renderings. I wouldn't have had photographs of anything built. But real quickly, what is it? The map on the right represents the Atlanta region primarily through our transit system. This is our MARTA map, and it shows you kind of the 4 lines going out to the cardinal points. And the light gray is our beltway, our perimeter loop highway, Interstate 285. And this is the core of the region. And the region itself, depending on whether it's the air quality area or the metropolitan planning area, we stretch anywhere from 12 to 20 counties. It's about 110 miles north to south. You can fit the state of Delaware in that area. There's about 5.5 million people there. And while many regions across this country are now talking about outer loops or outer beltways, we in Atlanta are now looking at an inner one because we can't really add capacity for mobility anymore inside our beltway, our perimeter for roads. Just can't do it. Don't have the room, don't have the funds to buy property. And I think we all know the more you pave, the more people drive in some cases. So we're looking at doing an inner loop. And the reason why I say it's not relatively a new idea is because 100 years ago, Atlanta didn't have a congestion problem on its roads and freeways. We had a congestion problem trying to get downtown to the railroad station. We had 33 railroads fighting for space downtown, and so 4 of the railroads built their own bypasses around that congestion that basically formed 4 belt lines. We are sewing those 4 belt lines back together to create a 22-mile ring inside the current beltway to connect 45 different neighborhoods through transit, trails, green space, art, and housing, and mixed-use development. So you can see on the left, these are some photos from those various belt lines. We own two of the 4 right now, or have them under control. So in some cases, top left, or in those photos, tracks have been removed many years ago, and it's been basically almost kind of an abandoned corridor. A corridor, by the way, which stretches anywhere from 70 feet wide to 200 feet wide, running through all parts of town. So 70 feet's a little tight. We need 40 feet for transit, but 200 feet, we have tremendous opportunity to do a lot of different things that I'm going to highlight in a second. Other places, we still have rails, but no trains. And then in some cases, we still have trains that we're working with the railroads on. Now, why did I show the map on the far right? Not just to get you oriented to Atlanta, but to show you that the Atlanta Beltline is actually an additional investment on top of the 35-year investment in MARTA. So MARTA, if they had a T-shirt, it'd be kind of a pejorative T-shirt, but it'd be like, MARTA's great, it just doesn't go anywhere. And I say this as a partner with MARTA. We love MARTA, the 9th busiest transit station in the country in terms of the people that ride it every day. In 35 years ago when it was started, so did the Washington Metro. It was started basically the same year. Same technology. I think we buy the trains from the same people. But interesting enough, Washington, D.C. and the region, as Chris highlighted earlier, built a place on top of its transit system to support it. We in Atlanta grew up really after World War II with the invention of the automobile, the air conditioning, and the interstate highway. And when you grow like that, you grow at interstate speeds. And so that's why we stretched out so far. Plus, we don't have any man-made or natural barriers to stop our growth. So MARTA, in some cases, works very well in town. It works in many ways as a commuter system, too, moving people from in the suburbs through Atlanta down to the airport or to sporting events. But our investment will come in, and I'll show you a little different map that focuses on this, and we're going to add 45 neighborhoods to the existing system, connecting a great deal of the city's population. So this gives you an idea. There's that outer beltway that I talked about, to Interstate 285 encircling the city. We're a concentric circle in the side. If you want a good apple, you better have a good core, so we're focused on that. It covers a great deal of area. This map is impossible to read from even the front row, and it's because it sits in our office and it's 10 feet tall. But you can see it's a 6,500-acre redevelopment area through a tax increment financing district. I'll highlight that. We master plan for 14,000 acres, basically going a quarter mile out in either direction of this rail line, looking at disconnections in the urban fabric and in the land use characteristics of the area. But you can see close to 25% of Atlanta's entire population lives within this area that we're talking about. In this map, the kind of bright green line, if you can find it, that's that rail corridor that we're talking about, anywhere from 70 to 200 feet wide. But what we're doing is looking outside of that, about a quarter mile on either side. Now, I mentioned it's transit, trails, and parks. I'm going to highlight them individually, but transit, this is a 22-mile loop around the city, 40 new station. Trails, 33 miles of brand new trails. It's multi-use trails. And then park space. That last bullet point's a big deal. Atlanta is one of the most underparked cities in the country. So when we compete for businesses, we're showing up very low in a ranking that is calculated to measure quality of life. While housing's cheap, gas is cheap, some of those other quality of life things score well, more of those cultural amenities, park space items we score very low, and that's hurting us in our competitive set right now across the country. When we add 1,300 acres of new parks to the City of Atlanta's park space, we increase it by 40%, not insignificant. So this highlights some of the major components, as I mentioned. The trails are basically parallel to that 22-mile loop of transit, but we're also spreading out in trail spurs, so we can connect out to about another 25 neighborhoods doing that as well. We're going to build about 5,000 units of affordable housing, and that's probably about 5,000 out of 20,000 units of new housing. And at the end of the day, we'll also generate about $1.5 billion of new property tax increment. So I talked about transit. It won't be like the subway that MARTA is now, or Metro. These are, this is not a new idea, right? New Orleans has had one for years. I bet back in the day, close to 100 years ago, Baton Rouge probably had a streetcar line as well. We're coming back to that with new technology. It's much cheaper to build. Our traditional kind of heavy rail or MARTA system is anywhere up to $150 million a mile. Okay, very expensive. Light rail or modern streetcar can be done as little as $15 million, or at most maybe 20 to 25 for us. Remember, we already have the right-of-way, so we're kind of taking the rails out, cleaning it up. That used to be there for the old industrial rail lines, and bringing back trains for people. But you can see we're tying in those big circles to the existing MARTA system, and then adding upwards of 50 new stations. 33 miles of trails and new parks. They're underway right now. We have about $230 million worth of work in the ground underway right now. And one of the things that Meredith highlighted was a phased approach, and something that Mayor Tom Murphy said earlier is if you can get some of these components, these phases in place, and we were at breakfast this morning, and he actually quoted this kind of a pseudo-planner who had quite an impact on New York City, Robert Moses. If you can drive that stake in the ground, very few will have the courage to pull it out. And so that's what we're doing with the Atlanta Beltline, is we're building these trails and parks right now as we raise the money and do the planning engineering for transit. 1,100 acres of our corridor and adjacent properties are brownfields. We're working to clean those up right now. We've cleaned up about 50 acres so far. And then this layers into some of the stuff you guys are working on with Louisiana Speaks, and with what Meredith mentioned on the work they're doing there in Virginia. We went a quarter mile out in either direction from that train line because we know that we've got to connect people to it. It's not just having a station and then hoping everything changes. We got to connect people via sidewalks and via complementary land uses. And so we've gone through a master plan process. Half of those have been adopted by City Council. They go into the city's comprehensive development plan. Each one of these takes about a year. We are upzoning around transit stations. We're identifying disconnects in sidewalks and streets, and then programming the dollars to make that happen. And this gives you an idea of what that looks like. There in the center is that green kind of swoosh of a line. That's the rail corridor. This is on the right. That kind of weird shaped building is the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and Center. And then on the left of the main green line of the corridor is a new park. We assembled industrial kind of parking lots and scrap metal yards and brownfields into a new 17-acre park in Dr. King's neighborhood where he grew up that never had a park, a people space. So we were able to identify things like that. Real quickly, where are we right now? 50% of the right-of-way, as I mentioned, that 22-mile loop is under control. We're moving forward through our environmental impact statement on the transit. And you can see we're now opening up the corridor for people actually to use. We've acquired close to 300 acres of green space on our way to 1,300. We've completed about 3.5 miles of permanent trail, as you can see what it looks like there on the right. In many ways, connecting neighborhoods that were disconnected before. And we'll start construction on another 2.5 miles in October. Of the 1,300 acres of new parks, this is one of our big ones. This is a 300-acre quarry that existed just west of Midtown and downtown. You can see in that picture on the left the skyline there at the very top. We'll fill that 400-acre hole of granite with water. That'll give the city a 30-day emergency supply of drinking water, which increases its current supply from 3 days to 30 days. And then overnight creates a 300-acre park, which is 100 acres bigger than our biggest park, which is Piedmont Park. So it's rare that a city in the United States can generate that kind of green space in a singular 300-acre park in the 21st century, almost unheard of. The 17-acre park I mentioned in the old historic Fourth Ward, you can see what this looks like here, kind of moving things forward. It's a detention facility as well, so we're dealing with some of our stormwater issues. We're retaining and detaining that water and reusing it on site. We're installing photovoltaic panels on all of our new parks to net meter the energy load for these parks. So when we return these back to the city and they come on the city's books, there's no energy bill. And you can see this is under construction right now. That lake is 90,000 square feet, so it's not insignificant in what this redevelopment does. And through this detention facility, it stops the flooding in the neighborhood that was keeping that brick building in the background from being redeveloped. That brick building is an old Sears warehouse and catalog center. It's 2 million square feet in size. And it's the biggest building in the southeastern United States. It's huge. It's been sitting there basically vacant. It's on the public's tax rolls at $0. We're now helping to get that sold. That goes on the private tax rolls. Immediately overnight, it'll start generating $500,000 in property taxes with nothing in it. That all of that then flows towards us to help build what we're building. So it's actually a way these things work together. Again, kind of more parks that are under construction right now. These are the stakes that we're driving in the ground that the neighbors can own, that they can claim ownership of, they can love, and they can say we want more of. You're going to see a bunch of kind of what I call these are the baby photos. Trails are important too. The other thing about the Atlanta Beltline, which is really unique, we have a unique equity issue. A 22-mile loop hits some of the most affluent and some of the poorest neighborhoods in our city, and we have to be thoughtful about where we spend dollars, when we spend dollars. Some parts of town just want congestion relief, and other parts want jobs. Some folks don't care about parks. Some folks don't want parks. They think parks drive crime and raise property values. So then we establish a community land trust to deal with economic displacement. I mean, I could go on and on about all the various things that we're up to. Again, another kind of trail opening, lacing through this neighborhood's called Buckhead, right around the corner from where I live. Affordable housing, 15% of all of the net income or proceeds we generate through our bonding program goes into an affordable housing trust fund. We've got about $8.8 million in there right now, and we can acquire land for redevelopment and affordable housing construction. We can provide mezzanine or gap financing or construction financing for redevelopment. When you have no developers who need financing or no developers looking to acquire property, we try to be creative and go to the closing table and actually have down payment assistance. So we have a program that's basically a zero-interest loan for 15 years, and if you stay in your home for 15 years, it's forgiven. And we've been able to move close to 30 families into homes just in the last 6 months. We didn't have this program 7 months ago. None of this money was flowing, and we came up with a new way to get it into place, and so we'll continue to do that as well. Since we've started, our organization's only been around about 3 years, Atlanta Beltline, Inc. There's been about $1 billion of new development, generating close to $200 million in new property tax increment, so we've issued bonds on about half of that. And coming back to that stake idea, art is something that's extremely important because we can do it now. It's relatively inexpensive when you look at the cost of transit at over $1 billion. And this large mural on the top is in the West End neighborhood, which would have been a blank wall had we not brought the community together to paint this mural. And had it been a blank wall, something else would have been on it, I'm sure. And this mural has been up and not been touched once by graffiti, and the neighborhood loves it and they own it. And so the artist community is a very active and vocal community, and right now we have the largest public arts program going on in the history of the city just for a few dollars, and it's called Art on the Atlanta Beltline. And these are kind of some of the last photos here. And we pulled this whole program together basically with $50,000 out of our budget in about 7 different places. And then we raised another $50,000 in the community. We have a jobs training program. We're actually training the people that live in our neighborhoods to build the parks and trails and transit in their neighborhoods. We had our first graduating class this year. 100% were offered jobs, and a number of them are actually on the construction teams building the parks. And this series of slides gives you an idea of what it'll look like. This is what it looks like today. In some cases, those rails are already removed, anywhere from 70 to 200 feet wide. The first thing we're putting in is the trail and some kind of stormwater management controls. And then over time, we add the development connections to the development on the edges, and we can add a train. This is all what we can fit in that exact same corridor that's coursed throughout the city and provides tremendous connectivity to the rest of town. So lastly, we have a 501c3 partner organization. It's kind of like the Beltline Foundation. We've raised close to $40 million privately in support of these efforts. You can see a lot of the, some of your same partners, Cox Enterprises, basically the owner of that is Jim Kennedy. He's been writing checks, and a lot of our corporate sponsors as well. We're on the top left, Atlanta Beltline Inc. We fit in with a kind of a circle of partnerships. There's no way we get this done without public-private partnerships and public-public partnerships. I think you all know that too. The key is making sure every one of these people in this circle have ownership and have skin in the game, so when things get tough, they can't go anywhere. At the end of the day, it's about a $2.8 billion project. About a little more than half of that was totally raised locally and privately, but we're obviously going to have to get out there and get some of those federal transit funds. This is really one of my last slides. We started as a grassroots concept. It started at the neighborhoods. The neighborhoods went to kind of the next layer up in kind of city political hierarchy, and then they went to the city council, and then they went to the mayor. And that's why we're here today as an organization. So that's about as much as I can tell you about the Atlanta Beltline. We call that the sip from the fire hydrant. But that, I think we're ready for questions, Rachel.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Yes.
Question is, are the schools involved? And the schools are absolutely involved for two main reasons. And I'm probably guessing because you mentioned the art first, are the teachers and the schools themselves and the children involved. I'm going to come to that second. First, we got the schools involved as a partner from a financial standpoint right off the bat through the property tax too. So the three entities that participate in property tax in Atlanta are the City of Atlanta, Fulton County or Fulton Parish, and then the Atlanta Public Schools. So they came on early as a partner, and then we've actually developed a fairly robust kind of in-school campaign. We have a whole other kind of presentation about the 18 Atlanta Beltline schools that we're connecting to. We are actually building learning modules at the elementary, middle, and high school level. We unveiled our first one at the end of school last year in middle school, and it was an amazing amount of work these kids did. They went out on the street and they did all kinds of models and stuff. So they are absolutely involved. And our arts program, we just kind of pieced it together with kind of bubble gum and duct tape in the last few months. So we're now trying to build that up and get some more meat on the bones. But absolutely, the schools are so important. I think you all know that if you can get the kids on board, the parents will kind of come along. But it's also, it's bigger than that for us. It's for a lot of our schools, the kids are, they're at risk. They're at risk from a health standpoint because of lack of mobility and a lack of play space and things like that. They're also at risk because of safe schools and things like that. So we have a lot of different things we're working with the schools on, but vitally important.
Yeah, I'd like to see that happen within just that.
Sure. Absolutely.
Thank you, Glenn.
Yeah, I'm very happy to question for you. You have, I'm pretty sure like your development program, you talked about how the many plans donated or I wonder if you want to develop that one with the financing or doing some of those buildings, everything that has to be at that level. Is, I think all of us are looking at right now, we're looking at there's a lot of places where the things we want to do, the code might allow it, but nobody can finance what we want to see. There's some compromises I would say. I'm just curious to know what your research that
I just want to make sure I understand the question. So you're asking about how to get financing for?
The buildings that you showed on the station.
Yes.
Did you check those for can we build in the private sector? Are we subsidies?
We did not get to that level of detail. We looked at the amount of revenue that could be generated for the localities through tax increment financing or a transportation improvement district that could be applied, but we didn't specifically look at how much would be required.
One of the things on that, not to just weigh in, but the next level of market analysis is probably looking at what are the comparative rents in downtown Newport News versus where the majority of the office market is, which is suburban? And what level would they have to be to move people over and then start that chain? I mean, because it looks like the work that you guys did is, if it got all built, it would have this huge impact. But your question is, how do you get from today to getting it built? And each block may be a little different, but yeah. Now's a good time to buy real estate, though, if you got any money.
Jane?
Question for John. You have two examples that were where a community development corporation was very heavily involved. Is this some sort of growing trend, or I mean, from your view of this, do you feel that this is a real possibility?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know if it's a growing trend in terms of TODs, but I think that the community development corporations help to close the financing gap that Glenn was just asking about, because they tend to be eligible or more creative in terms of bringing in new market tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, or just grants. So in terms of the TODs I've studied, and I looked at over 100 of them back in 2004 when I was doing my dissertation, I wouldn't say that community development corporations are the majority or even a substantial portion of developers of TODs. But in this new economy where things are very different now than they were a few years ago, I think that there's a good opportunity for looking at some of those examples and for community development corporations in different cities and regions around the country, for them to learn about TOD and understand that they can be a major player in being a champion of a TOD. So I'm not 100% sure if I know the answer, if it's a growing market or not, because I haven't really studied it from a CDC perspective, but it was kind of a finding that came out of the research I was doing.
It's probably tough for CDCs just because at transit you're going to need density, which is typically more expensive, and the CDCs really work around the housing and smaller retail stuff. But.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
My question is, I heard a lot of reference to the tax increment financing, which, did a lot of property tax and sales tax. I know Louisiana kind of tax increment financing only focused on the sales tax aspect. How would you be able to close that large gap if say, for instance, you're in a low-income distressed community that really doesn't have adequate retail, that really not generate a lot of sales tax, in order to kind of create a tax increment financing district when Louisiana only uses sales taxes toward tax increment financing?
It's a really good question, and it's interesting. I've been on the job at the helm of the Atlanta Beltline for about a year or so now, and when I was meeting with the board early on, I said, listen, our largest component of our local economic model is tax increment financing, which is predicated on new development or rising property values, right? None of which are really happening in Atlanta. And to your point, in an economically challenged area, may be challenged for some time. And so what we did in creating our tax increment financing district is it includes the entire loop, which includes some of the most expensive neighborhoods in Atlanta and obviously some of the poorest neighborhoods. Now, we only pledge the property tax, not the sales tax in this case. So to your specific question here in Louisiana about sales tax, obviously it's kind of a tool that you can't use if this neighborhood or area isn't generating any new sales, is to really think regionally or larger, to understand that the tide that affects a poor neighborhood affects a wealthy neighborhood, and that they are interconnected, and that in some cases to begin with you may have some kind of donor-donee relationship between neighborhoods, but if you start looking at kind of the displacement of negative impacts citywide, when you start evening these things out, you probably are saving the wealthy part of town money when you're helping other parts as well. But I don't know if I answered that exactly what you wanted, but it's a really good question, and we tried to kind of isolate and insulate that issue by doing a much larger area.
I wish we had time for some more questions, but I'm afraid we have to end, but I'm sure the speakers would be happy to stay around just a little bit. Thank you so much.
to seeing your presentation.